The dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through the basement window as I carefully wrapped Dad's old compass in newspaper. My hands trembled, not from the weight of the brass instrument, but from the weight of what I was about to do. 3 weeks since the funeral, and my stepmother Carol was already dismantling everything that made this house feel like home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I pressed the compass to my chest for just a moment, remembering how Dad used to let me hold it during our weekend camping trips. He'd tell me stories about how his grandfather carried it through the Pacific Theater, how it had guided 3 generations of our family through forests and mountains and life itself. To Carol, it was just another piece of clutter taking up space in her newly inherited house. Carol's heels clicked across the basement floor like a countdown timer. She surveyed the boxes I'd been packing with the satisfaction of a general reviewing conquered territory. Each cardboard container held pieces of my father's soul, artifacts he'd collected over 67 years of living fully and passionately. The vintage military medals, the antique pocket watches, the hand-carved chess pieces from his deployment in Germany. The leather-bound journals filled with his careful documentation of every item's history and significance. "Good, you're making progress," she said, checking items off her clipboard with aggressive efficiency. "The estate sale people will be here Thursday to pick up whatever the pawn shop doesn't want. I wanted everything gone by the weekend so I can start remodeling this dungeon into something useful, maybe a home gym or a wine cellar." A dungeon. She called Dad's sanctuary a dungeon. This was the room where he'd spent countless hours researching the provenance of each piece in his collection, where he'd taught me about history through tangible artifacts, where we'd shared quiet Sunday afternoons sorting through his latest acquisitions while he explained their significance. To me, it had been a treasure room. To her, it was wasted space. "Carol," I started, trying to keep my voice steady, "maybe we should get these appraised before we just sell them. Dad spent decades building this collection. Some of these pieces might be worth more than we think." She laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was the laugh she'd perfected during her 5-year marriage to my father, the one that made you feel foolish for caring about anything she deemed worthless. "Honey, I've seen the receipts. Your father paid garage sale prices for garage sale junk. The man couldn't tell the difference between a genuine antique and a reproduction if his life depended on it. He had good intentions, bless his heart, but he was what you'd call an optimistic collector." The emphasis she put on optimistic made it sound like a character flaw. My chest tightened with familiar frustration. Carol had never understood Dad's passion for history, had never bothered to listen when he explained the stories behind his finds. She'd tolerate his hobby with barely concealed annoyance, rolling her eyes whenever he'd excitedly show her a new addition to his collection. She'd married him for his house and his steady pension, not for his gentle soul or his fascinating mind. "I'm the executor of the estate," she continued, as if I could forget. "The lawyer made that very clear when he read the will. Your father left me in charge of disposing of his possessions as I saw fit, and I see fit to get rid of this hoard before it attracts mice. You're welcome to keep a few sentimental pieces, but the bulk of it needs to go. I have plans for this space." The will. Another knife in my back. Dad had always promised me that his collection would be mine someday, that I was the only one who truly appreciated the history and craftsmanship he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. But in his final months, battling the cancer that would eventually take him, he'd been heavily medicated and easily influenced. Carol had been there for every doctor's appointment, every lawyer's visit, every signature on every document. I'd been 3 states away, finishing my graduate degree in museum studies, trusting that Dad would be around long enough for me to come home and help him organize his affairs properly. "But please," I tried once more, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay composed. "At least let me contact someone who knows about historical artifacts. My professor at the university has connections with museums and collectors. What if there's something genuinely valuable mixed in with the rest?" Carol's expression hardened. She wasn't a cruel woman by nature, but she was practical to a fault. And she'd made up her mind. "We've already wasted 3 weeks on this, and I need the money from the sale to cover the funeral expenses and estate taxes. The pawnshop owner is coming tomorrow morning. And whatever he doesn't want goes straight to the estate sale company. End of discussion. The pawn shop owner was a weaselly man named Rick, who looked like he'd stepped out of a reality show about predatory businesses. He examined Dad's collection with the enthusiasm of someone forced to sort through actual garbage, picking up pieces with obvious distaste and setting them down with dismissive grunts. The beautiful Native American pottery that Dad had carefully researched and documented, Rick declared reproductions not worth his time. The Civil War-era photographs in their original frames, obviously fake according to his expert eye. The collection of antique surveying instruments that Dad had painstakingly restored, nothing but rusty junk taking up space. "I'll give you $800 for the lot," Rick announced after spending all of 20 minutes examining 60 years of careful collecting. "Take it or leave it, but that's being generous. Most of this stuff isn't worth the cost of hauling it away." $800. For a collection Dad had insured for over $50,000. For artifacts he'd lovingly maintained and meticulously cataloged. For pieces that had taken him to estate sales across 3 states, antique shows throughout the region, and countless hours of research in libraries and online databases. Carol shook Rick's hand without hesitation, already calculating how she'd spend the money. I stood there watching them load Dad's life's work into Rick's dingy van, like it was heading to a landfill. The compass I'd held that morning disappeared into a cardboard box with 20 other items Rick hadn't even bothered to examine individually. The leather journals containing all of Dad's research notes, the ones that documented the provenance and history of each piece, were dismissed as scrap paper and tossed into Rick's trash bin. That evening I sat in my childhood bedroom, staring at the 5 items Carol had grudgingly allowed me to keep. A small wooden jewelry box Dad had carved for my mother before I was born, a faded photograph of him in his army uniform from his deployment in Korea, a brass letter opener he'd used at his desk for 30 years, a snow globe from our family vacation to Yellowstone when I was 12, and one of his research journals, the one I'd managed to sneak out of the pile when Carol wasn't looking. I opened the journal and began reading Dad's careful handwriting, his detailed notes about purchase dates, and research findings, and historical significance. Each entry was a love letter to history, a testament to his genuine passion for preservation and education. He hadn't been collecting junk. He'd been curating pieces of American history, building a personal museum that told the story of ordinary people who'd done extraordinary things. The compass I'd held that morning was documented in meticulous detail. Dad had traced its ownership back through 4 generations of the Hartwell family, from its purchase in 1943 through its service in 3 different military campaigns. He'd corresponded with the Hartwell descendants, had copies of letters and military records, had even located the original receipt from the Chicago compass maker, who'd crafted it by hand. It wasn't just a compass, it was a tangible link to the greatest generation, an artifact that belonged in a military museum, not Rick's van. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Every item Carol had dismissed as junk was actually a carefully researched piece of authentic American history. The Native American pottery was documented with tribal provenance and museum authentication letters. The Civil War photographs had been verified by 3 different historical societies. The surveying instruments were rare examples of 19th-century American manufacturing, complete with original cases and documentation. My father hadn't been an optimistic collector. He'd been a legitimate historian who'd spent 6 decades building a museum-quality collection of American artifacts. And Carol had just sold it all to a pawn shop owner for $800. I closed the journal and wiped away tears that had been building for hours. The weight of what had been lost, of what had been destroyed through ignorance and greed, felt crushing. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, something else began to build alongside the grief. A cold, determined anger that felt nothing like the helpless frustration I'd been carrying for weeks. Carol thought she'd won. She thought she'd cleared out the clutter and could move on with her remodeling plans and her tidy little life. Rick thought he'd made a quick profit off some gullible widow who didn't know the value of what she was selling. They had no idea what was coming next. The next morning found me hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by photocopies of Dad's research notes and every scrap of documentation I could find in his desk drawers. My eyes burned from hours of staring at the screen, but I couldn't stop. Every search led to another revelation about the true value of what had been stolen from our family legacy. The Hartwell compass alone was worth more than Rick had paid for the entire collection. I'd found 3 similar examples in museum archives, each valued between $12,000 and $15,000. The authentication letters Dad had carefully preserved proved its military service record beyond any doubt. A legitimate military antiques dealer would have recognized its significance immediately. Carol wandered into the kitchen around noon, humming softly as she made her coffee. She'd been in an excellent mood since closing the deal with Rick, already making plans for her basement renovation. The contractors were coming next week to give estimates for knocking out walls and installing proper lighting. She wanted to create an entertainment space where she could host her book club meetings and wine tastings. "Making progress on your job search?" she asked, glancing at my laptop screen with mild curiosity. I told her I was looking for museum positions, which wasn't entirely untrue. I was researching museums, just not for employment purposes. Actually, I said carefully, I've been thinking about Dad's collection. I found some interesting information about those pieces Rick bought yesterday. Carol's expression shifted slightly, the contentment fading into something more guarded. She'd learned to recognize the tone in my voice that meant I was about to challenge her decisions. "Sweetie, we've been through this. Your father was a sweet man, but he wasn't an expert. He got excited about things that looked old, but that doesn't make them valuable. Rick has been in the antique business for 20 years. He knows what he's looking at." I turned my laptop screen toward her, showing the auction results for a compass identical to Dad's, sold last month for $14,800. The provenance documentation was almost identical to what Dad had in his files. "This isn't speculation, Carol. This is market value from actual sales." She barely glanced at the screen before waving dismissively. "Online auction prices don't mean anything. People get caught up in bidding wars and pay ridiculous amounts for things that aren't worth half that much. Besides, how do you know your father's compass was authentic? He could have been fooled by a good reproduction. Because he had it authenticated by..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 different military historians, I replied, pulling out the photocopied letters from Dad's files. Because he corresponded with the Hartwell family descendants who confirmed its service record. Because he spent 2 years researching its provenance before he even purchased it. Dad wasn't some amateur collector grabbing random items at garage sales. He was methodical, thorough, and incredibly knowledgeable. Carol's jaw tightened. She didn't like being contradicted, especially not when money was involved. Even if some of those things were worth more than Rick paid, it's too late now. The transaction is complete, and frankly, I don't have time to second-guess every decision. The estate needs to be settled so I can move forward with my life. But what if Rick knew they were valuable? What if he deliberately lowballed you because he recognized pieces that Dad had spent decades authenticating? I kept my voice calm, but inside I was seething. The more I researched, the clearer it became that Rick had systematically undervalued every single item. Either he was incompetent, or he was a predator who targeted grieving families. "That's a serious accusation," Carol said coldly. "Rick has an established business with good reviews. He gave us a fair assessment based on his professional expertise. I'm not going to entertain conspiracy theories about some elaborate scheme to cheat us out of money we never had in the first place." She left the kitchen with her coffee, effectively ending the conversation. But I wasn't ready to give up. I spent the afternoon calling every museum and historical society within a 100-mile radius, describing Dad's collection and asking about authentication services. The responses were universally encouraging. Several curators expressed genuine interest in the pieces I described, particularly the Civil War photographs and the surveying instruments. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the State Historical Museum was particularly helpful. She specialized in 19th-century American artifacts and had written extensively about the importance of preserving personal collections that documented ordinary citizens' experiences during significant historical periods. When I described Dad's collection, she immediately grasped its potential significance. "Your father sounds like he was doing museum-quality curatorial work," she said during our phone conversation. "The level of documentation you're describing is exactly what we look for when evaluating potential acquisitions. Many amateur collectors focus on the objects themselves, but your father understood that provenance and historical context are what transform artifacts into genuine educational resources." I told her about the sale to Rick, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Dr. Vasquez had encountered similar situations before, she explained. Unscrupulous dealers who targeted estate sales and grieving families, knowing that most people had no idea how to properly evaluate historical artifacts. It was a particular problem in our region, where military history and westward expansion had left behind countless valuable items in family collections. "Would you be willing to look at the documentation I have left?" I asked. "I know the physical pieces are gone, but I have photographs and all of Dad's research notes. Maybe you could help me understand what was really lost." Dr. Vasquez agreed to meet me the following day at the museum. I spent that evening organizing every piece of documentation I could find, creating a comprehensive inventory of Dad's collection based on his meticulous records. Each item had its own file, with photographs, purchase receipts, authentication letters, and historical research. The scope of what he'd assembled over 6 decades was staggering. The meeting with Dr. Vasquez exceeded my worst fears and highest hopes simultaneously. She examined Dad's documentation with growing amazement, recognizing immediately that he'd been operating at a professional level that many museum curators would envy. His research was thorough, his authentication processes were rigorous, and his instincts for historically significant pieces were exceptional. "This is extraordinary work," she said, flipping through the files for the 3rd time. "Your father identified and acquired artifacts that most museums would be thrilled to add to their collections. The Civil War photography collection alone represents a significant historical resource. These images document the everyday experiences of soldiers and civilians in ways that official military records never captured." She pointed to specific pieces in Dad's documentation, explaining their rarity and historical importance. The surveying instruments were examples of American manufacturing techniques that had contributed to westward expansion. The Native American pottery represented specific tribal traditions that were increasingly difficult to document and preserve. The military medals and decorations told the stories of individual service members whose contributions might otherwise be forgotten. Based on current market values and museum acquisition standards, Dr. Vasquez estimated that Dad's collection was worth somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000. The compass alone, with its documented military service record, would have been a cornerstone piece for any military history museum. Rick had essentially stolen $250,000 worth of authentic American historical artifacts for $800. "I have to ask," Dr. Vasquez said gently, "was there any legal obligation for the estate executor to obtain professional appraisals before disposing of valuable assets? Because what you've described sounds like a significant breach of fiduciary responsibility." The legal question had been nagging at me since my conversation with Carol. I'd been so focused on the emotional betrayal that I hadn't considered the legal implications of selling valuable estate assets without proper evaluation. Carol had legal authority as executor, but she also had legal obligations to manage the estate responsibly and in the best interests of all beneficiaries. That evening, I called my law school roommate Jennifer, who'd specialized in estate law and now practiced in the state capitol. She listened to my story with professional interest, asking detailed questions about the timeline, the documentation, and Carol's actions as executor. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling from a legal perspective. "Your stepmother had a fiduciary duty to maximize the value of estate assets," Jennifer explained. "Selling valuable items without proper appraisal could constitute a breach of that duty, especially if she knew or should have known about their potential value. The fact that your father had extensive documentation about the collection's significance makes her position even more precarious." Jennifer recommended several courses of action. First, document everything possible about the collection's true value, which I'd already started with Dr. Vasquez's help. Second, investigate Rick's business practices to determine whether he'd engaged in any deceptive conduct. Third, Consider whether Carol's hasty disposal of the collection violated her legal obligations as executor. But Jennifer also warned me that estate litigation was expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Success would depend on proving both the collection's value and Carol's negligence or misconduct. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my grief over losing Dad had transformed into something much more focused and determined. This wasn't just about the money, though the financial loss was staggering. It was about justice for Dad's life's work, accountability for Carol's betrayal, and ensuring that Rick couldn't continue preying on grieving families. Carol thought she'd cleaned house and moved on with her life. Rick thought he'd made a quick profit from some widow's ignorance. Neither of them understood that they'd just declared war on someone who'd inherited more than historical artifacts from her father. I'd inherited his patience, his attention to detail, and his absolute commitment to preserving the truth. They had no idea what kind of storm was about to break over their heads. The investigation into Rick's business practices began with a simple internet search that quickly spiraled into something much darker. His pawn shop, Riverside Collectibles, had a pattern of reviews that painted a disturbing picture. Grieving families consistently complained about lowball offers on estate collections, elderly customers who felt pressured into quick sales, and items that somehow appeared in high-end auction houses just weeks after being purchased for pennies on the dollar. I created a fake social media profile and joined several online collector forums where Rick was surprisingly active. He bragged about his estate sale finds, with photographs that made my blood boil. There was Dad's compass, now listed as a rare World War II navigation instrument with complete provenance documentation, priced at $18,000. The Civil War photographs were being marketed as a, quote, museum-quality collection of battlefield imagery, with a starting bid of $25,000. Every single piece he'd dismissed as worthless reproduction was now being sold at its true market value. But Rick had made a crucial mistake in his greed. He'd photographed Dad's authentication letters and research documentation as part of his sales listings, apparently not realizing that the letterheads and signatures could be traced back to their sources. I spent 3 days contacting every museum curator, military historian, and authentication expert whose names appeared in Dad's files. Their responses were uniformly outraged. Dr. Michael Chen from the National Military History Foundation was particularly incensed when I sent him screenshots of Rick's listings. He'd personally authenticated several pieces in Dad's collection and had corresponded with Dad for over 5 years about various military artifacts. Seeing his authentication letters being used to sell items he'd certified for research purposes triggered an immediate response. "This is completely unethical," Dr. Chen told me during our phone call. "When I authenticate items for private collectors, it's with the understanding that they're building legitimate collections for historical preservation. Your father was one of the most ethical collectors I've worked with. He never tried to flip items for profit. This dealer is essentially using our professional reputations to commit fraud." Dr. Chen connected me with other professionals in the field who'd worked with Dad over the years. The community of serious military historians and authentication experts was smaller and more tightly knit than I'd realized. Within a week, Rick's auction listings were being reported and flagged by dozens of legitimate professionals who recognized the unethical use of their authentication work. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered Rick's tax situation. Jennifer had suggested investigating whether he was properly reporting his income from these transactions, and what I found was a goldmine of evidence. Rick had been operating 2 separate business models. The pawn shop reported minimal income and claimed most purchases as worthless scrap or donation write-offs. Meanwhile, his online auction business operated under a different name and LLC structure, selling the same items at massive markups without any connection to the original pawn shop purchases. The paper trail was astonishingly sloppy. Rick had been running this scheme for years, targeting estate sales and grieving families throughout the region. He'd purchase collections for hundreds of dollars, document them as low-value scrap for tax purposes, then sell them through his auction business for tens of thousands without reporting the profits properly. The IRS was very interested in businesses that showed consistent patterns of purchasing worthless items that somehow transformed into valuable auction pieces. Meanwhile, my case against Carol was building momentum through a different channel. Jennifer had referred me to Patricia Westfield, an estate litigation specialist who'd handled similar cases of executor misconduct. Patricia was fascinated by the documentation I'd assembled and immediately recognized the strength of our position. "Your stepmother's actions constitute multiple breaches of fiduciary duty," Patricia explained during our initial consultation. "She had access to your father's detailed research files, which clearly established the collection's value and significance. Disposing of documented assets without proper appraisal while having actual knowledge of their worth is textbook executor misconduct." Patricia had encountered Rick's business before in other estate cases. His pattern of targeting newly widowed women and elderly estate executors had caught the attention of several attorneys in the region. We weren't just building a case against Carol's mismanagement. We were contributing to a larger investigation into Rick's predatory business practices. The first domino fell when the IRS audit hit Rick's businesses simultaneously. Federal agents seized his financial records, computer systems, and inventory from both the pawn shop and the auction warehouse. The military authentication experts I'd contacted had provided sworn statements about the fraudulent use of their professional work, and the paper trail Patricia had helped me document showed clear evidence of tax evasion and fraudulent business practices. Rick's online auctions were immediately suspended pending investigation. Dad's compass and several other pieces were recovered as evidence, though most of the collection had already been sold to unsuspecting collectors across the country. The Financial Crimes Unit estimated that Rick had defrauded estate sellers out of over $2 million during his years of operation. Carol's first indication that her problems were just beginning came when she received a formal notice of estate litigation challenging her actions as executor. Patricia had crafted a comprehensive complaint alleging breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of estate assets, and gross negligence in the administration of Dad's estate. The dollar amounts involved were staggering enough to potentially force the sale of Carol's house to satisfy any judgment. But Carol's real panic began when she realized that Rick's criminal investigation had created a paper trail leading directly back to her transaction. Federal investigators contacted her as part of their case against Rick, asking detailed questions about her knowledge of the collection's value and her decision-making process as executor. The existence of Dad's research files, which she'd had access to throughout the estate administration, made her claims of ignorance increasingly difficult to maintain. The media attention started small, with a local newspaper article about the federal investigation into estate fraud targeting grieving families. But the story had compelling human interest elements that larger outlets couldn't resist. A respected military veteran's life work being stolen by predatory dealers, a grieving daughter fighting to preserve her father's legacy, and a federal investigation that had uncovered years of systematic fraud targeting vulnerable families. Carol tried calling me after the first news article mentioned her by name as the executor who'd sold the collection. Her voice was shaky, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. The confident woman who'd dismissed Dad's life work as garage sale junk was suddenly realizing the magnitude of what she'd done. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "This has gotten completely out of hand. Maybe we can work something out privately, without all this legal drama. I think there's been some misunderstanding about your father's collection." "The misunderstanding," I replied calmly, "was your assumption that Dad was an ignorant amateur who collected worthless reproductions. The federal investigation has recovered documentation proving that his collection was worth over $300,000. You sold it for $800 to a dealer who's now facing federal fraud charges. There's no misunderstanding here, Carol, there's just consequences." She tried several different approaches over the following weeks. First came anger, accusing me of being ungrateful and vindictive, threatening to countersue for harassment and defamation. Then came bargaining, offering to split any recovery from Rick's criminal case or to use her house as collateral for a settlement. Finally came desperation, claiming that she'd been manipulated by Rick and had trusted his professional expertise. But Patricia had prepared me for Carol's evolving defense strategies. The documentation was too clear, and the evidence of her access to Dad's authentication files was too strong. Carol had known exactly what she was disposing of. and she'd chosen the quickest, easiest path, regardless of its impact on the estate's value or Dad's legacy. Rick's plea agreement provided the final piece of our case. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he admitted to systematically defrauding estate sellers over a 7-year period. His detailed confession included specific admissions about recognizing the value of Dad's collection and deliberately misrepresenting his assessment to Carol. The federal prosecutor's office estimated that Rick had paid less than 10% of fair market value for items he immediately resold at full market rates. The civil settlement came 18 months after Dad's funeral. Carol agreed to pay $400,000 in damages, plus attorney fees and court costs. Her house, which she'd planned to renovate with the money from selling Dad's collection, had to be sold to fund the settlement. Rick's criminal conviction resulted in 3 years in federal prison and full restitution to his victims, though most of the physical artifacts were never recovered. Dr. Vasquez from the State Historical Museum had followed the case closely and reached out to me as the legal proceedings concluded. The museum was launching a new exhibit on private collectors who'd made significant contributions to historical preservation, and she wanted to feature Dad's work as an example of ethical collecting and meticulous research. The exhibit opened on what would have been Dad's 68th birthday. His surviving research files and the few recovered artifacts were displayed alongside testimonials from the historians and authentication experts who'd worked with him over the years. The centerpiece was his compass, returned by federal investigators after Rick's conviction, displayed with all of Dad's original research documentation and provenance files. I stood in the museum gallery that evening, surrounded by visitors who were learning about Dad's passion for preserving American history through tangible artifacts. Children pressed their faces against the display cases, reading about the compass that had guided soldiers through 3 different wars, examining the Civil War photographs that documented ordinary people during extraordinary times, studying the surveying instruments that had helped map the expanding American frontier. Carol had dismissed Dad's collection as worthless junk taking up space in her basement. Rick had seen it as an opportunity to exploit grieving families for easy profit. Neither of them had understood that they were dealing with genuine historical treasures, or with a daughter who'd inherited her father's patience, determination, and absolute commitment to preserving the truth. The basement Carol had wanted to convert into an entertainment space was now empty, the house sold to satisfy legal judgments. Rick's pawn shop was permanently closed, its inventory distributed among his numerous victims. The predatory scheme that had targeted vulnerable families was dismantled, and federal prosecutors were using their case as a model for similar investigations nationwide. I kept one item from Dad's collection that had never been part of the sale: a small wooden jewelry box he'd carved for my mother decades before I was born. Inside, I placed a copy of the museum exhibit brochure and a letter from Dr. Vasquez explaining the historical significance of Dad's work. Someday, when I have children of my own, I'll tell them about their grandfather, who understood that preserving history meant preserving the stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. The silver compass in its museum display case had found its way home, not to a basement collecting dust, but to a place where its story could inspire future generations to value their own family histories and understand their connection to the larger American story. Dad would have been proud. 5 years have passed since that afternoon when Carol dismissed Dad's life work as basement clutter. The museum exhibit featuring his collection has become a permanent installation, inspiring countless visitors to explore their own family histories and understand the value of preserving personal artifacts. Dr. Vasquez regularly invites me to speak at conferences about the importance of proper estate planning for collectors and the dangers of predatory dealers who target grieving families. My own career has flourished in ways I never expected. The publicity from our case led to consulting opportunities with families facing similar situations, helping them navigate estate evaluations and avoid the mistakes that cost us so dearly. I've become something of an expert on authentication fraud and estate protection, working closely with law enforcement agencies to identify and prosecute dealers who exploit vulnerable sellers. The wooden jewelry box Dad carved for my mother sits on my mantle now, holding not just the museum brochure but also letters from other families who've reached out after hearing our story. Each one represents another collection saved from predatory dealers, another legacy preserved for future generations. The ripple effects of our battle continue to protect families across the country. Carol moved to a small apartment across town after losing her house to the settlement. We pass each other occasionally at the grocery store, exchanging polite nods but nothing more. The woman who once confidently dismissed historical artifacts as garage sale finds now works part-time at a department store, her dreams of basement renovations and wine tastings buried under legal judgments and federal investigations. Rick served his full sentence and was released last year, but his reputation in the antiques community is permanently destroyed. The database of fraudulent dealers that emerged from our case has made it nearly impossible for him to return to his predatory practices. Sometimes justice takes time, but it finds its way eventually. Dad's compass still gleams behind its museum glass, pointing true north for visitors who stop to read its remarkable story. Children trace its journey through their fingertips against the display case, learning about courage and service and the importance of preserving family history. In death, Dad's passion for collecting has touched more lives than he ever imagined possible. I think about him every time I visit the exhibit, remembering the quiet Sunday afternoons we spent in his basement sanctuary while he shared the stories behind each treasured piece. Carol saw junk where there were actually jewels. Rick saw profit where there was actually priceless heritage. But Dad saw what mattered most, the human stories that connect us across generations. The girl who once helped her father catalog artifacts in a dusty basement had grown into a woman who understood that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how long they take or how much they cost. We'd won more than money or museum displays. We'd won the right to honor Dad's memory properly and ensure that his dedication to preserving American history would inspire others for decades to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.